Recording by James K. White. Mystery of the Sea by Bram Stoker. Chapter 34. The Accolade. When Marjorie arrived, I had all ready for our exploration. There were several packages waiting for her, and when she emerged from the room where she had gone to change, their purpose was manifest. She appeared in a flannel tennis frock, short enough to show that she had put on her sand shoes on her bare feet. She saw that I noticed and said with a little blush, "You see, I'm dressed for the part. You came back so wet the last time that I thought I had better prepare for it too." "Quite right, my dear," I said. "That pretty head of yours is level." We went to the cellar at once, where I had lamps and candles prepared and ready to light. I showed Marjorie how to get up and down by herself, in case anything should happen to me. This made the gravity of our enterprise apparent. Her face grew a trifle anxious, though she did not change color. I could see that all her anxiety was for me, and none for herself. We took care to bring a plentiful supply of matches and candles, as well as an extra lamp and an oil can, and some torches and red and white lights. All these were in a tin box to ensure their being kept dry. I had a meal of bread and meat packed ready. Also a bottle of water and a flask of brandy, for the exploration might take a long time. The tide was not quite out, and there was still in places a couple of feet of water, but we decided to go on at once, as it would give us more time if we started on a falling tide. I took Marjorie first up the passage inland, so that she might understand something of the lines of the cave system. There was, however, too much tide just then to show her where I surmised there might be some deep opening, perhaps permanently under water, into some of the other caves. Then we retraced our steps, and gained the pile of debris of the explosion at the cave's mouth. I could not but notice how much Marjorie was impressed by the stillness of the place. Here the tide, filtering in by innumerable crevices and rifts between the vast pile of stones, showed no sign of the force of waves without. There was not time for the rise and fall of waves to be apparent, but the water maintained its level silently, except for that ceaseless gurgle which comes with the piling in of water anywhere, and is so constant that it does not strike one as a sound. It was borne in upon us that the wildest storm without would make no impress upon us here in this cavern deep, and with it, as an inevitable corollary, came the depressing thought of our helplessness should aught go wrong in the fastness of this natural prison. Marjorie bounded over the slippery stones like a young deer, and when we passed through the natural archway into the cave beyond, her delight was manifest. She was hurrying on so quickly that I found it necessary to tell her she must go slow, as to be able to take stock of all around her as she went. It was needful to look back as well as forward, so that she might recognize the places when coming the other way. I reminded her of caution by holding up the great ball of stout cord which I carried, the end of which was attached to the rope of the windlass in the cellar. "Remember, dear," I said, "that you have to be prepared for all eventualities. If necessary, to go back alone and in the dark." She shuddered a little, and drew closer to me. I felt that the movement was one of protection rather than of fear. When we went along the passage, where on the first occasion I had found the water rise nearly to the roof, we had to wait. A little way ahead of us, where the cave dipped to its lowest, the water was still touching the top. We possessed our souls with what patience we could, and in about half an hour's time we were able to pass. We were quite wet, however, for only our faces and our lamps were above water, with the exception, of course, of the tin box with the candles and matches and our provisions, which I took care to keep dry. Marjorie's delight at the sight of the huge red cave was unspeakable. When I lit one of the red lights, the blinding glow filled the place, exposing every nook and corner, and throwing shadows of velvet blackness. The natural red of the granite suited the red light, the effect being intensely rich. Whilst the light lasted, it was all like a dream of fairyland, and Marjorie hung on to me in an ecstasy of delight. Then, when the light died down and the last sparks fell into the natural darkness, it seemed as if we and all around us were steeped in gloom. The little patches of faint light from our lamps seemed to our dazzled eyes to openly emphasize the surrounding blackness. Marjorie suggested that we should explore the great cavern before we did anything else. I acquiesced, for it was just as well that we should be thoroughly acquainted with the various ramifications of the cave. I was not by any means sure as yet that we should be able to get to the cave of the treasure. Here, all around us, was red. We were entirely within the sienite formation. When I had been first in the cave I had not seen it lit up. Only where the comparatively feeble light of my bicycle lantern had fallen had I seen anything at all. Of course, it may have been that the red light which I had burned had misled me by overwhelming everything in its lurid glow. So this time I got a white light out of the box, and lit it. The effect was more ghastly and less pleasant. In the revealing glare, the edges of everything stood out hard and cold, and so far repulsive that instinctively Marjorie drew closer to me. While the light remained, however, I was able to satisfy myself of one thing. All around was only the red granite. Color and form and texture all told the same thing. We had passed the stratification of gneiss, and entered on that of the sienite. I began to wonder and to think, though I did not at once mention the matter to Marjorie. The one guiding light as to locality in the Don's narrative was the description of the cave, the black stone on one hand and the red on the other. Now at Broadhaven, the gneiss and the red sienite join, and the strata in places seem as if welded together or fused by fire. Here and there can be found patches in the cliff where it is hard to say where one class of rock ends and the other begins. In the center bay, however, to the north of my house, there is a sort of dip in the cliff, covered deep with clay, and bright with grass and wild flowers. Through this a tiny stream rushes in wet weather, or in dry trickles down the steep incline. This is the natural or main division between the geological formations, for on either side of it is a different kind of rock. It was here that I expected to find that the treasure cave was situated. It had been, of course, impossible for me, though I had had a compass with me, to fix exactly the windings of the cave. I knew, however, that the general trend was to the right. We must, therefore, have passed behind the treasure cave and come into the region of red granite. I began to have an idea, or rather the rudiment of one, that later on we should have to go back on our tracks. Inasmuch as my own house stood on the gneiss formation, we should have to find whereabout in the cave windings the red and the black rocks joined. From this point we might be able to make new and successful progress towards discovery of the treasure itself. In the meantime I was content to linger a few minutes in the great cavern. It was evident that Marjorie was in love with it, and was at present in a whirl of delight. And, after all, she was my world, and her happiness my sunshine. I fully realized in the delightful passages of our companionship the truth of the lover's prayer in Herrick's pretty poem. Give me but what this ribbon bound. Take all the rest, the sun goes round. Every day, every hour, seemed to me to be revealing new beauties of my wife's character and nature. She was herself becoming reconciled to our new relationship, and in the confidence of her own happiness and in her trust of her husband, the playful and sweet sides of her nature were gaining a new development. I could not help feeling at times that all was going on for the best, that the very restraint of the opening of our married life was formative of influence for good on us both. If all young husbands and wives could but understand the true use of the old-fashioned honeymoon, the minute knowledge of character coming in moments of unconscious self-revelation, There might be more answers in the negative to the all-important 19th-century philosophical query, is marriage a failure? It was evident that Marjorie was reluctant to leave the cave. She lingered and lingered. At last, in obedience to a command of hers, conveyed, for she said nothing, in some of those subtle feminine ways, which, though I did not understand their methods, I was beginning to learn to obey, I lit a torch. Holding it aloft, and noticing with delight how the light danced in my wife's beautiful eyes as she clapped her hands joyously with the overt pleasure of a child, I said, "Her Majesty wishes to inspect her new kingdom. Her slave awaits her pleasure." "Lead on," she said. "Her Majesty is pleased with the ready understanding of her royal consort, and with his swift obedience to her wishes. And oh, Archie, isn't this simply too lovely for anything?" The quick change into the vernacular made us both laugh, and taking hands like two children, we walked round the cavern. At the upper end of it, almost at the furthest point from where we entered, we came across a place where, under an overhanging red wall which spread out overhead like a canopy, a great rock rose from the level floor. It was some nodule of especial hardness which, in the general trituration, had not been worn away by the wash of the water and the rolling of pebbles which at one time undoubtedly helped to smooth the floor. In the blinking light of the torch, the strength of which was dimmed in the vastness of the cavern, the isolated rock, standing as it did under the rocky canopy whose glistening surface sent down a patchy reflex of the glare, seemed like a throne. The idea occurred simultaneously to both of us. Even as I spoke I could see that she was prepared to take her seat. "Will not Her Majesty graciously take her seat upon the throne, which the great overlord Nature has himself prepared for her?" She took the stick which she carried to steady her in the waiting, and holding it like a sceptre, said, and oh, but her sweet voice sounded like far music stealing through the vastness of the cavern, "Her Majesty, now that she has ascended her throne, and so formally taken possession of her kingdom, hereby decrees that her first act of power shall be to confer the honor of knighthood on her first and dearest subject. Kneel, therefore, at the feet of your queen. Answer me by your love and loyalty. Do you hereby promise and vow obedience to the wishes of your queen? Shall you love her faithfully and truly and purely? Shall you hold her in your heart of hearts, yielding obedience to all true wishes of hers, and keeping the same steadfastly to the end? Do you love me?" Here she paused. The rising emotion was choking her words. The tears welled in her eyes and her mouth quivered. I was all at once in a fire of devotion. I could then, and indeed when I think of it I can now, realize how of old, in the days when loyalty was a passion, a young knight's heart flowered and blossomed in the moment of his permitted devotion. It was with all the truth of my soul and my nature that I answered, "I do love you, O my gracious queen. I hereby take all the vows you have meted to me. I shall hold you ever, as I do now, in my very heart of hearts. I shall worship and cherish you till death parts us. I shall reverence and obey your every true wish, even as I have already promised beside the sea and at the altar. And whithersoever my feet may go in obedience to your will, my queen and my love, they shall go on steadfast to the end." Here I stopped, for I feared to try to say more. I was trembling myself, and the words were choked in my throat. Marjorie bent over as I knelt, laid her wand on my shoulder, and said, "Rise up, Sir Archibald, my own true knight and loyal lover." Before I rose I wanted to kiss her hand, but as I bent, her foot was temptingly near. I stooped lower to kiss it. She saw my intention, and saying impulsively, "Oh, Archie dear, not that wet, dirty shoe," kicked it off. I stooped still lower and kissed her bare foot. As I looked up at her face adoringly, a blush swept over it and left her pale, but she did not flinch. Then I stood up, and she stepped down from her throne, and into my arms. She laid her head against my shoulder, and for a few moments of ecstasy our hearts beat together. End of Section 34. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.